Okay, in this video we're talking about factoring the difference of squares. And so the rule there is kind of the reverse of what we looked at before with our special cases of multiplying polynomials. We talked about how a plus b times a minus b gave us the square of the first minus the square of the second, right? Well, this is just working backwards, okay? So it's undoing what we did before with the multiplication. Now the key to that is our structure of what our answer is going to look like is over here. We're going to have an a plus b and an a minus b. But notice we start with the square of the first and the square of the second, okay? Now, in order to undo a square, there's something that we have to use which is called a square root, okay? A square root. Now, this is something that you can do on your calculator, or another way to think of it is what times what times itself gets you to a squared? What times itself gets you to b squared? Well, a times a is a squared, so the first term would be a. B times b is b squared, so the second term would be b. And then we'd have a plus and a minus, okay? Now, if you don't want to think of it that way, you could always just take the square root of the number on your calculator. But when it comes to the variables, you got to think about what times itself gets you to that power, okay? For instance, to get to an x squared, we have x times x gets us to x squared, right? So the square root of x squared would be x, okay? So since we have x times x equals x squared, the square root of x squared would give us x, okay? So that's what we need to think about here is what times itself would get us to that square. So when we're working backwards here, let's look at these examples. In this first one here, our a term here, the a squared is x squared and the b squared is minus 25, okay? So going back here, maybe we can even kind of clear this up a little bit. The a squared is our x squared and the b squared is our minus 25 there, or 25, okay? Now what we're going to break it up into is the square root of the first term and the square root of the second term, one with a plus and one with a minus, okay? So if I take the square root of x squared, just like we said over there, x times x is x squared, so the square root of x squared would give us x. So that's going to be our first term. Then if we take the square root of the second term, what times itself gives you 25? 5, right? 5 times 5 is 25. And you can also do that in your calculator, but we would get 5, okay? So we get x plus 5 times x minus 5. Now, if you weren't sure, you could always FOIL this through and see that we would end up back where we started. If we FOIL this, x times x would give us x squared. X times the negative 5 gives us minus 5x. 5 times x gives us plus 5x. And then positive 5 times our negative 5 gives us minus 25. Then, of course, our middle terms here, since we have a minus and a plus, they cancel out. And we would get back to x squared minus 25. Okay? Let's try the same process with these guys, okay? So again, we're going to have one binomial with a plus, one binomial with a minus. We got to take the square root of the first term. And the first term is 16x squared. Now, this has two parts to it, okay? So since we have two parts to it, we take the square root of the number and we take the square root of our variable here, okay? And I kind of blocked out the 1 here, but what is the square root of, did it again. What is the square root of 16? 4, because 4 times 4 is 16, right? So we'd have 4 for the first part, and then what's the square root of x squared? X. So our first term would be 4x, okay? Another way to look at it is 4x times 4x gives us 16x squared, right? 4 times 4 is 16, x times x is x squared. Then the second term that we're taking the square root of is 9. What's the square root of 9? 3, because 3 times 3 is 9. So this would be our binomial, and this would be our two binomials being multiplied, our factors, and that would be our answer, okay? Let's try number 4, okay? So again, we're going to have two binomials here, one with a plus, one with a minus. Then we're going to take the square root of the first term. Now again, we're taking the square root of both. Think of it, but you can think of it separately for now. What's the square root of 4? 2, right? So we know the first term is going to involve 2, but then we also have to take the square root of k squared. Well, what's the square root of k squared? K, okay? So again, another way to look at it is understanding that 2k times 2k is equal to 2 times 2 is 4, right? And k times k is k squared, okay? So that's why we said that the square root of 4k squared is 2k. Then we take the square root of 9, and we talked about this in the last one. The square root of 9 gives us 3. So this would be our solution, okay? Then number 5, again, we have 1 with a plus, 1 with a minus. Take the square root of the first one. What's the square root of n squared? N, because n times n is n squared, right? So we have n. Then we take the square root of the second one. Square root of 4 is 2. So this would be our solution. Okay?